The Boeing 737 cruised at 37,000 feet through the midnight darkness above the Atlantic, its cabin filled with the gentle hum of pressurized air and the soft breathing of sleeping passengers. In Seat 14C, Commander Valkyrie Valk Thorn had finally succumbed to exhaustion, her military-issued duffel bag clutched against her chest like a shield. The flight attendants had long since dimmed the cabin lights, and most travelers were lost in dreams of destinations that awaited them in Frankfurt. But something was wrong. The subtle shift began in the galley, where two flight attendants exchanged glances that lasted a heartbeat too long. Then, moving with the fluid precision of predators, 6 men in civilian clothes began to rise from their scattered seats throughout the cabin. They wore the unremarkable uniforms of business travelers, khakis, polo shirts, baseball caps pulled low, but their movements betrayed years of tactical training. Each step was measured, deliberate, silent. Valk's breathing remained steady, her face peaceful in sleep, unaware that the noose was tightening around her. The lead operative, a weathered man with steel-gray eyes, approached her row first. His hand moved to his waistband with practiced efficiency, fingertips grazing the grip of a concealed Glock 19. Behind him, his team created a perfect circle of containment, blocking every potential escape route with bodies that looked casual but formed an impenetrable tactical formation. The aircraft's engines maintained their steady drone, but something had changed in the cabin's atmosphere. Other passengers slept on, oblivious to the deadly ballet unfolding around them. The operative closest to the emergency exit row, a compact woman with surgeon's hands, placed her palm against the sealed door, ensuring no sudden movements could compromise their operation. Valk shifted slightly in her sleep, her military-trained subconscious registering some disturbance in the environment. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the duffel bag strap, and her breathing pattern changed by the smallest fraction. Years of combat had hardened her instincts into something approaching supernatural awareness, but exhaustion was a powerful enemy. The lead operative raised his hand, fingers spread wide, then slowly closed them into a fist. The signal rippled through his team like electricity through copper wire. 6 men, each a decorated Navy SEAL, each with more confirmed kills than most soldiers see battles, surrounded the sleeping figure of a woman who had been flying home from what she thought was just another routine briefing at the Pentagon. What Valk didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that 3 hours earlier encrypted communications had crackled across military networks worldwide. Her name appeared in classified cables marked with the highest priority designations. Something had gone catastrophically wrong, and somehow, impossibly, Commander Valkyrie Thorn had become the most wanted person in American military history. The silence stretched like a held breath as the SEALs waited for their moment to strike. Valk's eyes snapped open. She'd been expecting them. In the sterile fluorescent lighting of the Pentagon briefing room 18 hours earlier, Valk had sat ramrod straight in an uncomfortable metal chair, her dress blue uniform bearing the insignia of her rank and the subtle wings that marked her as a naval aviator. Across the table, 3 generals and 2 admirals studied classified documents with the intensity of surgeons examining X-rays of a terminal patient. The air conditioning hummed with mechanical efficiency, but sweat still beaded along Valk's collar. Commander Thorn, General Harrison's voice carried the weight of 4 decades in uniform. His gray mustache twitched as he spoke, a tell she'd learned to read during her years navigating military bureaucracy. Your service record is extraordinary. The pause hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Valk kept her expression neutral, though her mind raced through possible reasons for this meeting. Extraordinary could mean many things in Pentagon speak, and few of them were good when delivered in a room lined with security clearance warnings and electronic surveillance equipment. Admiral Chen leaned forward, her weathered hands folding over a manila folder thick enough to stop small-caliber rounds. 17 confirmed air-to-air kills in 3 combat deployments, Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters. Navy Cross for actions above and beyond. She paused, her dark eyes studying Valk's face for any reaction. And according to your psychological evaluations, you have an almost pathological need to prove yourself. The words hit like flak bursts, designed to provoke a response. Valk had learned long ago that silence was often the most powerful weapon in rooms like this. She'd been the only woman in too many briefings, endured too many subtle challenges to her competence, survived too many attempts to push her into emotional reactions that would validate their preconceptions. The Navy invested $14 million in your training, General Morrison added, his Boston accent lending a sharp edge to each syllable. FA-18 Super Hornet qualification, weapons system certification, carrier operations. He gestured at the stack of papers before him. Yet here you are, requesting assignment to a transport squadron, flying cargo planes. The accusation implicit in his tone was clear. She was wasting her potential, running away from the sharp end of military aviation. What they couldn't understand, what the reports and psychological evaluations failed to capture, was that Valk had seen enough combat to last 3 lifetimes. She'd watched friends die in cockpits, held radio conversations with pilots whose voices faded into static and flame. The need to prove herself had been replaced by something more complex, the desire to serve without constantly dancing on the edge of death. "Permission to speak freely, sir." The words came out steady, professional. General Harrison nodded, his expression unreadable. "I've been fighting this war for 8 years, Valk said, measuring each word carefully. "I've dropped ordnance on targets from Afghanistan to Syria. I've flown missions where coming home wasn't guaranteed, and I've lost more friends than I care to count." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "But I've never stopped serving my country." The silence that followed carried the weight of judgment. Lieutenant Colonel Meridian Reaper Cross had earned her call sign the hard way. Through 15 years of flying the deadliest missions the Air Force could devise and bringing her aircraft home when other pilots became statistics. Now, as she reviewed the classified briefing materials in her temporary office at Ramstein Air Base, she felt the familiar knot of tension building in her stomach that preceded every impossible assignment. The folder marked Operation Nightfall contained photographs that would have given civilian intelligence analysts nightmares for months. Satellite imagery showed scattered debris across a mountainous region of eastern Afghanistan, the twisted remains of what had once been a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. The crash site told a story written in scorched earth and scattered metal, a story that didn't match the official reports flowing through military channels. According to those reports, Captain Rodriguez and his crew had experienced mechanical failure during a routine supply drop to forward operating base Kestrel. Engine trouble, adverse weather conditions, pilot error, the usual catalog of explanations that reduced human tragedy to administrative footnotes. But Reaper had flown enough missions in that particular slice of hell to know that mechanical failures rarely created debris patterns consistent with surface-to-air missile impacts. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message that made her blood run cold. The text was brief, written in the clinical language of military intelligence. "Survivor recovered. Transport pilot. Female. Critical condition. Request immediate extraction to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center. Clearance. EYES only." The survivor's name appeared at the bottom of the message. Commander Valkyrie Thorn. Reaper's hand stopped moving across the keyboard. She'd heard whispers about Valk, every female military aviator had. The stories followed her through mess halls and briefing rooms like contrails behind a jet. The Navy pilot who'd racked up more confirmed kills than most entire squadrons, who'd flown missions so classified that their details would never appear in any official record, who'd requested transfer to transport duty after burning through every combat assignment the Pentagon could throw at her. But if Valk had been flying transport missions, what had she been carrying that was important enough to shoot down? And more importantly, who had been shooting? The folder contained one additional document that made Reaper's training and experience irrelevant: a direct order from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stamped with security classifications she'd never seen before. The language was unambiguous: retrieve the survivor, maintain absolute operational security, trust no one outside the designated chain of command. The mission parameters read like something from a spy novel rather than a routine medical evacuation. Reaper closed the folder and walked to the window overlooking the flight line. Outside, aircraft mechanics swarmed over a collection of helicopters and transport planes with the organized chaos of an ant colony under attack. The morning sun caught the rotor blades and turned them into spinning mirrors that reflected fragments of light across the tarmac. Somewhere in a medical facility she couldn't name, Valk was fighting for her life while carrying secrets that apparently justified shooting down American aircraft. The thought sent ice through Reaper's veins. The intercom crackled to life with the mechanical voice of air traffic control. "Reaper, you're cleared for immediate departure. Your package is waiting." She grabbed her flight suit and headed for the door, knowing that some packages were too dangerous to deliver and too important to leave behind. The MH-60 Black Hawk helicopter cut through the thin air above the Afghan mountains like a mechanical bird of prey, its rotors beating a steady rhythm that matched the elevated heart rate of every person aboard. In the cramped passenger compartment, Staff Sergeant Marcus, Ghost, Kowalski checked his weapon for the 15th time in 20 minutes while studying the terrain maps spread across his knees. The GPS coordinates on his tablet showed their destination as a small landing zone carved into a mountainside that looked, from satellite imagery, about as hospitable as the surface of Mars. 5 minutes out, the pilot's voice crackled through the comm system, barely audible above the engine noise and rotor wash. "LZ looks hot. We've got movement on the ridgeline to the north." Ghost exchanged glances with the other members of his rescue team: Corpsman Daniels, whose medical bag contained enough trauma supplies to rebuild a human being from spare parts, and Sergeant Park, a communications specialist whose encrypted radio equipment could reach anyone from the Pentagon to a forward operating base in Kandahar. They'd been briefed on the mission parameters during the flight from Bagram, but the details remained frustratingly sparse. High-value target, critical extraction, need-to-know basis only. What they knew was this: an American pilot had survived an aircraft crash in hostile territory and had been evading capture for 36 hours. What they didn't know was why this particular pilot warranted a special operations extraction mission with security classifications that made their normal rules of engagement look like suggestions. The helicopter began its descent toward the landing zone, and Ghost caught his first glimpse of the crash site. The debris field stretched across nearly a quarter-mile of rocky terrain, scattered fragments of what had once been a C-130 transport plane, now reduced to twisted metal and carbon scoring. The impact pattern was wrong, too spread out, too consistent with an aircraft that had been breaking apart in flight rather than during a single catastrophic impact. "Jesus," Daniels whispered, his voice barely carrying over the intercom. "What the hell happened down there?" Through his binoculars, Ghost spotted movement near a cluster of boulders about 200 meters from the main wreckage. A figure in torn flight suit waved weakly at the approaching helicopter, and even from this distance, he could see the dark stains that marked where blood had soaked through fabric. The pilot, their package, had managed to survive not just a missile strike, but nearly 2 days in some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan. "There," Ghost pointed toward the figure, "that's our girl." The Black Hawk touched down in a whirlwind of rotor wash and flying debris, its engines maintaining power for immediate departure. Ghost and his team moved with practiced efficiency, crossing the rocky ground in tactical formation while scanning for threats. The mountains around them seemed to watch with malevolent patience, offering 1,000 hiding places for enemy fighters with rocket-propelled grenades. As they reached the survivor, Ghost's breath caught in his throat. The woman sitting propped against the boulder wore the tattered remains of a Navy flight suit, her face streaked with blood and dirt, but her eyes still sharp with intelligence and determination. Her left arm hung at an unnatural angle, and her flight helmet lay cracked beside her, but she was conscious and alert. "Commander Valkyrie Thorn," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "Thanks for the ride." Ghost knelt beside her while Daniels began his medical assessment, checking for wounds that could prove fatal during the helicopter ride back to base. But what struck him wasn't her injuries or her remarkable survival. It was the way her eyes kept moving, scanning the ridgelines and valley approaches with the constant vigilance of someone who knew that death could arrive from any direction at any moment. She wasn't just a crash survivor. She was a warrior who'd been shot out of the sky and was still fighting. The medical evacuation helicopter's cabin had been transformed into a flying intensive care unit, its normal passenger seating replaced with a stretcher system that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Corpsman Daniels worked over Commander Thorn with the focused intensity of a watchmaker, his hands moving in precise patterns as he checked vital signs, adjusted IV drips, and monitored the portable medical equipment that kept her stable during the flight to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center. Valk drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind floating between the present moment and memories that felt more vivid than reality. In her dreams, she was back in the cockpit of her FA-18 Super Hornet, pulling 6GS in a vertical climb while enemy surface-to-air missiles tracked her heat signature across a steel-gray sky. The sensation was so real she could feel the pressure suit inflating around her torso, could hear the urgent beeping of threat warning systems in her helmet. But when her eyes opened, she saw the concerned face of a young medic whose name tape read DANILS, and whose hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd treated combat wounds in conditions that would have challenged seasoned surgeons. The helicopter's engines maintained their steady drone, and through the small window beside her stretcher, she could see the green countryside of Germany passing below like a peaceful painting. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 hours to Landstuhl," Daniels replied without looking up from his equipment. "You've been in and out for most of the flight, lost a lot of blood but nothing we can't fix." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "Commander, there are some people who want to talk to you when we land. Important people." The words sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with blood loss or shock. Important people meant intelligence officers, meant classified briefings, meant that whatever had happened in Afghanistan was far from over. She tried to remember the details of the mission that had ended with her transport plane disintegrating around her, but the memories felt fragmented, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle scattered across a table. She'd been carrying something. That much she remembered. A cargo container marked with security classifications she'd never seen before, accompanied by 2 passengers whose names didn't appear on any manifest, and whose presence had been explained only as need to know. The flight from Kabul to Bagram should have been routine 90 minutes over familiar terrain, following flight paths she'd flown dozens of times before. But something had gone wrong, catastrophically, impossibly wrong. The missile that struck her aircraft hadn't come from known Taliban positions. The targeting had been too precise, too well coordinated, suggesting intelligence and equipment that shouldn't have existed in that particular sector of Afghanistan. In the seconds before the explosion tore through her cockpit, she'd glimpsed the launch signature on her threat warning display, a pattern that matched advanced surface-to-air missile systems that were supposed to be restricted to nation-state actors. "Commander," Daniels was studying her face with professional concern, "your heart rate just spiked. Are you in pain?" Valk shook her head, though the movement sent fresh waves of agony through her injured shoulder. The pain wasn't what worried her. It was the growing certainty that she'd been shot down by someone who knew exactly what she was carrying and exactly when she would be vulnerable. The attack hadn't been random or opportunistic. It had been an assassination attempt disguised as enemy action. which meant that somewhere in the classified channels of military intelligence, someone was working very hard to ensure she didn't survive long enough to tell anyone what she'd seen. The sprawling complex of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center appeared through the helicopter's windows like a small city dedicated to healing, its buildings connected by covered walkways and surrounded by parking lots filled with ambulances from across Europe. As the MH-60 Black Hawk settled onto the designated landing pad, a team of medical personnel rushed forward with equipment that could stabilize patients who'd suffered everything from improvised explosive device attacks to complex gunshot wounds. Valk felt the stretcher shift beneath her as she was transferred from the helicopter to a wheeled gurney, the movement sending fresh spikes of pain through her injured ribs. The faces above her blurred together, doctors, nurses, technicians, all moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who treated thousands of wounded warriors from Iraq and Afghanistan. The fluorescent lights of the emergency bay were harsh after hours of natural sunlight, and the antiseptic smell of the hospital triggered memories of other medical facilities, other times when she'd been wheeled through similar corridors. But this time felt different. This time, the glances exchanged between medical staff carried undertones of something beyond professional concern. The security personnel who flanked her gurney wore expressions that suggested they were protecting her from threats more complex than enemy fire. Dr. Elizabeth Wagner, the chief trauma surgeon, appeared at Valk's side as they moved through the corridors toward the operating theater. Her German accent was barely detectable, her English precise and clinical. "Commander Thorne, I'm Dr. Wagner. You've sustained multiple injuries, 3 broken ribs, dislocated shoulder, severe lacerations, and signs of a mild concussion. We're going to take excellent care of you." The operating theater doors swung open to reveal a room that looked more like a spacecraft than a medical facility, filled with monitors and surgical equipment that hummed with electronic precision. As the anesthesia mask descended toward her face, Valk caught a glimpse of 2 figures standing in the observation gallery above the operating table, men in dark suits whose presence suggested that her medical treatment was being monitored by people whose names would never appear in hospital records. "Count backward from 10. Dr. Wagner's voice seemed to come from a great distance. 10, 9, 8. The darkness that claimed her was different from sleep, deeper, and more complete. But even unconscious, some part of her mind remained alert, processing sounds and sensations that filtered through the pharmaceutical fog. Voices spoke in urgent whispers about security protocols and classified medical records. Footsteps moved through corridors with the measured pace of people conducting business that couldn't wait for visiting hours. Hours later, or perhaps days, time had become meaningless. She drifted back toward consciousness to find herself in a private room that looked more like a hotel suite than a hospital ward. The bed was comfortable, the lighting was soft, and the windows offered a view of German countryside that seemed almost impossibly peaceful after the harsh mountains of Afghanistan. But the 2 men sitting beside her bed wore expressions that suggested peace was a temporary illusion. "Commander Thorne," the older man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I'm Colonel Richards, Defense Intelligence Agency. This is Agent Morrison from the CIA. We need to talk about what happened during your last mission." Valk tried to sit up, wincing as her injuries reminded her that she was still far from fully recovered. "I need to make a report to my commanding officer." "Your commanding officer is dead," Agent Morrison said quietly. "Along with everyone else who had knowledge of Operation Nightfall. You're the only survivor, Commander, which makes you either incredibly lucky or the most dangerous person in American intelligence." The words hit her like physical blows, each revelation worse than the last. Her friends, her colleagues, the people who'd trusted her with missions that required absolute loyalty, all gone. And somehow, impossibly, she was the only one left to tell their story. The recovery wing of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center had been designed to provide wounded service members with an environment that promoted healing, but Valk's private room felt more like a comfortable prison cell. The windows were reinforced with transparent armor plating. The door required 2 different keycards to open, and the nurses who checked on her every few hours moved with the fluid precision of people trained in more than medical procedures. Colonel Richards sat in the leather chair beside her bed, a classified folder spread across his lap like a newspaper he was reading at breakfast. His silver hair and weathered face suggested decades of military service, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd transitioned from battlefield command to the shadowy world of intelligence operations. Agent Morrison stood near the window, his attention apparently focused on the German countryside, but his posture suggesting he was listening to every word spoken in the room. Operation Nightfall, Colonel Richards began, his voice carrying the weight of classified information, was designed to extract a high-value intelligence asset from Afghanistan, someone who possessed information critical to American security interests in the region. He paused, studying Valk's face for any reaction. What we didn't anticipate was that the extraction would be compromised from the beginning. Valk shifted uncomfortably in the hospital bed, her injuries protesting the movement. The memories of her last mission remained frustratingly fragmented, like pieces of a photograph that had been torn apart and scattered. She remembered preparing her C-130 for departure from Kabul, remembered conducting the pre-flight inspection with her usual thoroughness, remembered the 2 passengers who'd boarded her aircraft with security clearances that exceeded her own. The passengers, she said, her voice still hoarse from the intubation during surgery. Who were they? Agent Morrison turned from the window, his expression carefully neutral. Dr. Amara Hassan, a Pakistani nuclear physicist who'd been working with Taliban forces to develop radiological weapons. She'd agreed to defect in exchange for asylum in the United States. He paused, consulting his own folder. The second passenger was Captain James Mueller, a special operations officer assigned to ensure Dr. Hassan reached American custody alive. The names triggered a cascade of memories that came flooding back with startling clarity. Dr. Hassan had been a small woman in her 50s, wearing civilian clothes but carrying herself with the nervous energy of someone who knew that betraying the Taliban was effectively signing her own death warrant. Captain Mueller had been professional but tense, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings as if expecting attack from any direction. Dr. Hassan had information about a network of nuclear facilities hidden in the mountains along the Afghan-Pakistan border, Colonel Richards continued. Locations that weren't appearing in satellite imagery, installations that could produce weapons-grade uranium using techniques we hadn't seen before. His expression grew more serious. Intelligence that could have prevented nuclear terrorism attacks against American cities. The weight of that revelation settled over the room like smoke from a discharged weapon. Valk had been carrying more than passengers. She'd been transporting information that could have saved thousands of American lives. And someone had been willing to murder her entire crew to prevent that information from reaching its destination. The missile that shot us down, Valk said, her medical training allowing her to remain clinical even as rage built in her chest. It wasn't Taliban. The targeting was too sophisticated, the timing too precise. Morrison and Richards exchanged glances that confirmed her suspicions. We believe the attack was coordinated by someone with access to American intelligence networks, Morrison said quietly. Someone who knew your flight path, your departure time, your passenger manifest. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Someone who's been feeding information to hostile forces for months, maybe years. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of medical monitoring equipment. Outside the reinforced windows, German civilians went about their daily lives in blissful ignorance of the classified conversation taking place in the hospital room above them. Valk closed her eyes and tried to process what she just learned. Somewhere in the labyrinthine structure of American intelligence, a traitor was selling secrets that could cost American lives, and she'd become a target because she'd witnessed something that threatened to expose the entire operation. When she opened her eyes, both men were watching her with expressions that suggested the conversation was far from over. 3 days later, Valk stood before a bathroom mirror in her hospital room, studying the reflection of someone who looked like a combat veteran rather than a transport pilot. The surgical scar on her shoulder would fade with time, but the haunted expression in her eyes suggested damage that wouldn't heal as easily. The doctors had cleared her for limited activity, though limited was a relative term when applied to someone whose normal activities included flying military aircraft in combat zones. A soft knock on her door interrupted her self-assessment. She expected to see one of the nurses who'd been monitoring her recovery, but instead found a woman in Air Force dress blues whose bearing suggested she was accustomed to command positions. The silver eagles on her collar identified her as a colonel, and the wings on her chest marked her as a fellow pilot. "Commander Thorne, I'm Colonel Meridian Cross," the woman said, extending a hand. "Call sign Reaper. I've been assigned as your liaison officer during your recovery and debriefing process." Valk studied the newcomer with interest. Reaper's handshake was firm without being aggressive, her eye contact direct without being challenging. The subtle scars on her hands and the way she carried herself suggested someone who'd seen combat from the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. But her current assignment clearly involved responsibilities that extended beyond flying missions. "Liaison officer," Valk repeated. "That sounds like military speak for babysitter." Reaper's smile was genuine, lacking the careful neutrality that characterized most interactions with intelligence officers. More like translator. "You're about to be briefed by people who speak in acronyms and think in terms of geopolitical implications. Sometimes it helps to have someone around who remembers what it's like to worry about whether your aircraft has enough fuel to make it home." The honesty was refreshing after days of careful conversations with intelligence professionals who measured every word for its potential security implications. Valk gestured toward the chair beside her bed, and Reaper settled into it with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in her own skin. "How much do you know about what happened?" Valk asked. "Enough to understand that you've been through hell," Reaper replied. "Not enough to understand why someone wanted you dead badly enough to shoot down an American aircraft in broad daylight." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "But I know enough about military aviation to recognize that surviving a surface-to-air missile strike requires skill, training, and a significant amount of luck." Valk found herself appreciating the straightforward assessment. Most people who discussed her survival focused on the luck component, as if her 14 years of military flight training had been irrelevant to the outcome. The fact that Reaper understood the technical aspects of what had happened suggested she might be someone worth trusting. "There's something else," Reaper continued, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Your story has been spreading through military aviation communities worldwide. Female pilot survives missile attack, evades capture for 36 hours in hostile territory, provides intelligence that could prevent nuclear terrorism." She paused. "Whether you wanted it or not, you've become a symbol." The words sent an uncomfortable chill through Valk. She'd spent her entire career trying to be judged on her competence rather than her gender, fighting against the tendency to turn female military personnel into poster children for social progress. The idea that her survival might be transformed into some kind of inspirational story made her feel like a laboratory specimen. "I just want to get back to flying," she said quietly. Reaper's expression suggested she understood the sentiment all too well. "That's what we all want, Commander. But sometimes the mission changes, and we have to adapt to new orders whether we like them or not." Outside the hospital window, Afternoon sunlight painted the German countryside in shades of gold and green that seemed impossibly peaceful after the harsh mountains of Afghanistan. But peace, Valk was beginning to understand, was a luxury that people in her position couldn't afford. The secure conference room in the basement of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center looked like something from a spy movie, windowless walls lined with electronic equipment designed to prevent eavesdropping, a polished table surrounded by chairs that had hosted conversations involving the highest levels of American national security. Valk sat at one end of the table, still wearing hospital scrubs but feeling more alert than she had since regaining consciousness. The assembled officials represented a cross-section of American military and intelligence leadership that would have impressed her under different circumstances. General Harrison, whom she recognized from the Pentagon briefing that seemed like a lifetime ago, sat directly across from her with a folder so thick it could have stopped rifle rounds. Admiral Chen occupied the chair to his right, her expression unreadable. Colonel Richards and Agent Morrison flanked the table like bookends, their presence a reminder that this conversation would have implications extending far beyond military channels. "Commander Thorne," General Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that could affect thousands of lives, "the intelligence you were transporting has been confirmed as authentic. Dr. Hassan's information has led to the identification of 3 nuclear facilities that were completely unknown to American intelligence services." He paused, allowing the significance of that statement to settle. Facilities that could have produced enough weapons-grade uranium to supply terrorist organizations for decades. The words should have brought a sense of accomplishment, but instead, Valk felt only the hollow ache of losses that couldn't be quantified. Her crew was dead. Dr. Hassan was dead. Captain Mueller was dead. The intelligence that could have saved American lives had been purchased with the blood of people she'd been responsible for protecting. Admiral Chen leaned forward, her hands folded on the table. "What concerns us now is the source of the intelligence that led to your aircraft being shot down. The targeting was too precise, the timing too perfect to be coincidental." Her dark eyes fixed on Valk's face. Someone with access to classified flight information wanted to ensure that Dr. Hassan never reached American custody. Agent Morrison opened his own folder, revealing satellite photographs that showed the missile impact site with forensic precision. "We've analyzed the debris from your aircraft and the surrounding area. The missile that struck you was a Soviet-era SA-16, but it had been modified with targeting systems that don't appear in any known weapons manuals." He paused, selecting another photograph. The modifications required technical expertise and resources that suggest state-level support. The implications hit Valk like physical blows. Her crew hadn't died because of random enemy action or mechanical failure. They'd been murdered by people with connections to major intelligence services. The attack had been planned, coordinated, and executed with precision that suggested extensive advanced knowledge of American operations. "Who?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. General Harrison and Admiral Chen exchanged glances that suggested they were about to reveal information that would fundamentally change her understanding of the situation. "We believe the intelligence leak originates from within the Pentagon," General Harrison said quietly. "Someone with access to flight operations, personnel records, and classified mission parameters." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "Someone who's been selling information to hostile foreign intelligence services for an extended period." The conference room fell silent except for the barely audible hum of electronic equipment. Outside, the German countryside continued its peaceful existence, but inside the secured facility, American military leaders were confronting the possibility that one of their own had betrayed everything they'd sworn to protect. "Commander Thorne," Admiral Chen continued, her voice carrying the authority of decades in uniform, "we need your help to identify the source of the leak. Your survival makes you a witness to operations that were supposed to remain classified, and your testimony could be crucial in preventing future attacks. Valk looked around the table at faces that represented the highest levels of American military leadership, people whose decisions affected millions of lives across the globe. They were asking her to become more than a survivor. They were asking her to become an active participant in hunting down the person responsible for murdering her crew. The decision was easier than she'd expected. What do you need me to do? The answer to that question would transform her from a transport pilot into something else entirely, something that would require skills she'd hoped never to use again. 2 weeks later, Valk found herself in a briefing room at Ramstein Air Base, surrounded by maps, satellite photographs, and intelligence reports that painted a picture of betrayal extending far beyond her own mission. Her shoulder had healed enough to allow limited movement, but the psychological wounds remained fresh, manifesting in hypervigilance that made her scan every room for potential threats and every face for signs of deception. Colonel Reaper Cross sat across from her, reviewing a stack of personnel files with the methodical precision of a detective examining evidence. Their professional relationship had evolved into something approaching friendship, built on shared experiences of military aviation and the particular challenges faced by women in combat roles. But today's briefing would test that friendship in ways neither of them anticipated. We've identified 17 individuals with access to the classified information that would have been necessary to coordinate the attack on your aircraft, Reaper said, her voice clinical. Pentagon staff, intelligence officers, communications personnel, flight operations coordinators. She paused, selecting one file from the stack. All of them have been subjected to enhanced security screening, polygraph examinations, and financial audits. The process sounded thorough, but Valk had learned enough about intelligence operations to understand that determined traitors could beat most security measures if they were sufficiently motivated and careful. The person they were hunting had been selling American secrets for months or years, which suggested a level of sophistication that wouldn't be easily detected through routine screening procedures. Any leads? Valk asked. Reaper's expression grew troubled. 3 individuals showed anomalies in their financial records, unexplained deposits, lifestyle changes that don't match their military salaries, travel patterns that suggest contact with foreign intelligence services. She opened one of the files, revealing a photograph that made Valk's blood run cold. The man in the photograph wore the uniform of a Navy commander, his chest decorated with ribbons that indicated extensive combat experience and multiple deployments to overseas theaters. But it wasn't his rank or decorations that triggered Valk's recognition. It was the eyes, which she'd seen in briefing rooms and operations centers across half a dozen military installations. Commander David Park, Reaper continued, apparently unaware of Valk's reaction. Intelligence liaison officer assigned to Pacific Fleet operations. He's had access to classified flight information for 7 years, including the specific details of Operation Nightfall. She paused, studying the photograph. His bank records show deposits totaling nearly $2 million over the past 18 months, all from sources that can't be traced through normal,